Hey guys, tonight we begin with something wonderfully calm. So go ahead, dim the lights, settle into whatever blanket situation you've engineered for maximum coziness, and let your brain loosen its grip on the day. We're drifting far across the Pacific, past the noisy stuff, past the modern world, all the way out to the islands where things moved differently, slower, calmer, and with a surprising amount of responsibility resting on a single breadfruit tree. Because tonight's quietly uneventful saga is how Polynesian breadfruit gardeners managed entire clans with one tree, a history topic so soothingly mundane that it could probably rock a caffeinated parrot to sleep. So let's breathe in, breathe out, and start with the kind of people who didn't need palaces, gold, or royal drama to run a society. They just needed a tree. A very important tree. One that could apparently feed, clothe, settle disputes, stabilize social hierarchies, and support an entire generation of mildly stressed-out gardeners who wished everyone would just stop eating unripe fruit for once. We'll glide into the story gently, like drifting over warm water, like a canoe that isn't in a hurry because, honestly, it knows breakfast is guaranteed. The first thing to understand about Polynesian breadfruit culture is that it refused to be rushed. Breadfruit doesn't behave like your modern supermarket banana, shipped while green and forced into artificial ripeness under fluorescent lights. Breadfruit takes its time. It grows as if it has all the centuries in the world, which, to be fair, it kind of does. Once mature, a breadfruit tree can live for ages, outlasting the gardeners who planted it, sometimes outlasting their children, sometimes outlasting the entire drama-filled branch of the family who argued constantly about who was allowed to climb it. And on these islands, one good tree wasn't just a tree. It was a dynasty. It was the original family franchise. It was the here's your birthright, good luck package. Because breadfruit was not just food. It was identity. It was stability. It was the botanical version of that one grandparent who quietly pays everyone's bills. Polynesian societies, from Tahiti to Samoa to the Marquesas and beyond, built whole systems around gardening. Not farming in giant fields or mass harvesting, but gardening. Slow, patient, watchful care. Which sounds peaceful, and it was. But also, managing breadfruit trees was a strangely stressful profession because the entire community depended on them and everyone had opinions. While European kings were having dramatic breakdowns over succession crises and Spanish monarchs were marrying their cousins for the 17th time, Polynesian gardeners were just trying to keep fruit bats out of the breadfruit canopy. Different worlds. Different priorities. Now, let's float over to a typical island scene. Nothing dramatic, just the normal rhythm of a coastal village. The air warm. The water quiet. The distant thud of someone trying to husk a coconut without embarrassing themselves. And standing slightly uphill, like a wise elder observing the chaos below, is the breadfruit tree. Breadfruit trees are tall, but generous with shade. The kind of tree that looks like it knows things. The kind that could listen to a full hour of family gossip and simply rustle its leaves judgmentally. Under this green giant, the gardener, usually a man, though sometimes women held this role depending on the island, maintained an entire social contract. He wasn't a king, not quite a priest, but more than a common laborer, a specialist with knowledge passed down through generations, a keeper of varieties, a protector of root systems, a human version of a quiet spreadsheet that tracked who owed fruit, who gifted fruit, and who absolutely should not be trusted with fruit storage jars after that one incident. Each tree had a lineage. Each lineage had a keeper. And the keepers didn't just grow fruit, they managed people. Which was odd for a plant that looks like a lumpy green volleyball. Breadfruit itself it's fine. It will not shock your taste buds. It won't make your ancestors appear in a prophetic dream. It tastes like a starchy cousin of a potato that got lost at sea and decided to adapt. But in Polynesia, that starchy blob meant everything. Children grew up expecting it. Travelers depended on it. Leaders redistributed it. And gardeners? They agonized over it. Every stage of the breadfruit's life cycle involved decisions. Calm, quiet decisions. But decisions that shaped whole families. When to prune. When to harvest. When to store. When to let the neighbors borrow. When to pretend you didn't see someone's teenage son try to poke the fruit to see if it was ready yet. Breadfruit needed to ripen fully before it had value. But once ripe, it needed to be eaten immediately or preserved. And preserved breadfruit was the real treasure here. A dense, fermented paste stored in underground pits, capable of lasting months or years. Think of it like the world's calmest emergency ration. Steady, reliable, impressively bland. Just the way a sleepy historian's heart desires. Let's drift a little closer and look at how the breadfruit gardeners kept track of everything. Because this is where the story stops being casual gardening and becomes mildly complicated social engineering involving a lot of fruit. Across many islands, breadfruit trees could actually serve as markers of family alliances. One family might gift a sapling to another as part of a marriage arrangement. Another might exchange a rare cultivar. Yes, there were rare breadfruit varieties, because even ancient horticulturists needed bragging rights to seal a political bond. So when you see a cluster of breadfruit trees around an old settlement site, you aren't just seeing food. You're seeing treaties, agreements, arguments that definitely happened off-screen. The trees stood as living records, a slow-growing archive of who trusted whom. Gardeners became the caretakers of these political relationships. They remembered which tree belonged to which ancestor. They knew which fruit was owed to which family during which season. They knew which pit held preserved breadfruit that the chief could order distributed during lean months. And most importantly, gardeners knew the emotional condition of their community, because nothing revealed tension like the moment someone tried to claim fruit that was not theirs. Let's quietly examine the horticulture itself. Breadfruit trees weren't usually grown from seeds, because, inconveniently, many varieties didn't produce viable ones. So gardeners used cuttings or root shoots. They cloned the best trees, again and again, over generations. This meant one particularly beloved tree could end up with dozens of descendants scattered across the island. It also meant cultivars were ancient, consistent, and carefully named. Some had poetic names referencing ancestors. Some referenced qualities like soft, sweet, or good for storage. Some were probably inside jokes. History is full of those. Gardeners passed this knowledge down like treasure. And honestly, it was treasure. In hereditary castes where status could depend on your control of resources, knowing the secret catalog of breadfruit varieties gave you a quiet authority. A subtle influence. The kind of influence that didn't require yelling or swinging swords, just a well-maintained pit of fermented dough. Now let's drift toward the social layer underneath all of this. Because nothing is ever just about plants. Humans love layering meaning on top of nature until the nature itself starts looking stressed. Breadfruit wasn't only food. It was woven into origin stories, into mythic genealogies, into explanations of land and power. In some traditions, the first breadfruit tree grew from the body of someone who sacrificed themselves for their hungry family. A tragic origin, but softly tragic. The kind of story whispered at dusk. These myths didn't just explain the tree. They explained why the gardener's job mattered. The tree was life. The gardener was the steward of that life. And the community, well, the community was supposed to cooperate, ideally without making a scene. Did they always succeed? Of course not. Humans are humans. But the breadfruit system endured because it brought predictability in an environment where storms, droughts, and the occasional overly dramatic chieftain could disrupt everything else. Let's move gently to one final image for this part of the story. A calm evening. The sky drifting toward a muted lavender. Children half asleep in the warm air. The gardener making one last slow walk around the trees, checking branches, smelling the fruit, making quiet mental notes. Below, the village settles. Someone starts weaving mats. Someone else begins prepping a fire pit. A youth is trying, unsuccessfully, to flirt while carrying a basket of taro. And above them all, the centered, steady presence of the breadfruit trees. The long-lived giants overseeing generations. The quiet anchors that allowed clans to expand, travel, negotiate, argue, reconcile, feast, store, survive, and eventually thrive. It's not flashy history. There are no battles. No palace coups. No royal scandals. Just trees, and the people who built an entire way of life around them. In the next chapter, we'll float deeper into the daily responsibilities of Polynesian breadfruit gardeners. The subtle pressures, the gentle routines, the moments where horticulture, family politics, and traditional knowledge blended into a role that was more quiet authority figure than mere planter. But for now, just let the last image linger. A tree, a caretaker, a clan under its branches, a soft, unhurried world growing one fruit at a time. Breadfruit gardeners held a position that looked deceptively simple from a distance. Someone passing through a village might think, "Oh, that's the guy who checks on the trees." But when you drift a little closer, you realize the man with the long pole, gently tapping ripe fruit to test its firmness, was actually managing a quiet empire. A leafy, slow-motion empire where the key to power was knowing exactly when a fruit was about to drop, and exactly who would complain if it was harvested too early. This wasn't loud authority. It was the soft, stable kind. The kind that kept a community balanced without anyone needing to announce anything. And in Polynesia, where land was precious and families large, having control over a stable food source made you important in a way that didn't require crowns, jewels, or elaborate facial tattoos. Though, to be fair, some gardeners had those too. The job wasn't mutually exclusive with looking intimidating. Still, influence came from knowledge. Knowledge of trees. Knowledge of seasons. Knowledge of family histories so tangled that even the ancestors probably lost track halfway through. And every morning, the gardener rose early. Calmly. Naturally. Probably before sunrise, because roosters have never respected human sleep schedules. He walked out to the breadfruit groves while the air was still soft and slightly cool. The trees stood like giant umbrellas, their broad leaves catching the earliest light. And he began his quiet inspection. No rush, no checklist, just the practiced rhythm of someone who could sense the state of a tree the way a sailor senses shifts in the wind. He checked the bark for swelling. He felt for moisture in the soil. He touched the leaves, noting their texture. He tapped the fruit, listening for the right kind of thud. This was science without written charts. A long-term experiment measured not in hours but in generations. The gardener knew which trees fruited early, which ones took their time, which ones preferred shade, and which ones got fussy during the dry months. He also knew which trees were tied to which families, because nothing says ancestral tension like two distant cousins claiming the same fruit cluster. Let's glide deeper into the gardener's responsibility over storage. Because the true power of breadfruit didn't come from the tree alone. It came from what happened after. Fresh breadfruit is lovely in that mellow, potato-adjacent way. But one ripe fruit feeds a few people, not a whole village. And the trees produced seasonally. So communities needed a way to stretch that abundance through leaner months. Enter the fermentation pits, the unsung heroes. Quiet, underground time capsules of food security. These pits were dug deep, lined with leaves, and filled with breadfruit paste, fermented into a thick, dense, almost dough-like substance. Could last months, or years, or in astonishing cases more than a decade. Basically the Polynesian version of a savings account, except edible and occasionally smelly. The gardener was responsible for maintaining these pits, monitoring them, guarding the contents. Not physically guarding as in stand here all day with a stick, but socially guarding, knowing how much was inside, who had contributed, and how much needed to be distributed when a storm rolled in or a voyaging canoe crew needed supplies. Imagine the quiet power of being the only one in the village who could say, "Ah yes, the western pit still has enough for 2 months." And everyone believes you because you have never once miscounted a pile of fruit paste. In communities without written records, memory was everything. A good gardener became a walking archive. A human database with surprisingly strong opinions on humidity. Let's float over to a moment where political decisions rested on breadfruit management. Not a grand council. Not a battlefield strategy. Something softer. Something that starts with a chief calling the gardener over during a calm afternoon. The chief sits under a shade hut. Several elders sit nearby, pretending they're not listening. A mild wind comes in off the sea, carrying the taste of salt and mild gossip. And the question arises, should the village host a welcoming feast for an arriving canoe group? Hosting a feast wasn't just hospitality, it was diplomacy. A way of saying, yes, we're friendly. For now. But feasts required food. And food required breadfruit. And breadfruit required the gardener to do mental math that only he understood. How many trees were in their heavy season? How many pits were aging nicely? How much could be used without jeopardizing the coming months? The gardener gave his answer. Final. Something like, we can host, but not with the large offering. The southern pit is aging faster than expected. And that was that. The chief's decision aligned with the gardener's assessment, because nothing embarrasses a leader like a feast that runs out of breadfruit halfway through. You can negotiate treaties, settle disputes, even bless new canoes, but you absolutely cannot fail at feeding guests. So yes, gardeners shape diplomacy. Quietly, like advisors who wore vines and leaf fiber belts instead of robes of state. Now let's glide toward the family dimension of all this. Because families in Polynesia were large, extended, and wonderfully complicated. And the breadfruit tree sat right at the center of it all. A tree might belong to an entire lineage group. Everyone descended from a certain ancestor had rights to it. But rights did not mean freedom to climb, poke, prod, or casually whack the trunk with a stick. Breadfruit wasn't free-for-all produce. It belonged to people in specific ways. Fruit distribution followed rules. Rules followed tradition. And tradition followed the gardener's judgment. When a tree produced heavily, the gardener knew how much each household should receive. Not equally, because this wasn't a democracy, but proportionately based on status, contribution, and whatever complicated social math the ancestors had invented centuries earlier. But there was always someone unhappy. Boys. A brother-in-law insisting he deserved more because his daughter was practically an adult. An aunt who swore her branch of the family planted the tree, even if everyone knew they absolutely did not. A bored teenager trying to sneak fruit at night because he thought it was public fruit. Breadfruit drama was real, but it was soft drama, sleepy drama, drama that involved sighing more than shouting. And through all of it, the gardener stayed calm, explaining, redirecting, reminding people that these trees would nourish children not yet born. Long-term thinking was the foundation. A gardener didn't plan for one season, he planned for generations. When he grafted a new branch, he thought of descendants who might not exist for 50 years. When he shared saplings, he considered how that act would shape alliances. When he dug a fermentation pit, he imagined the day when a future leader might need it to feed a canoe fleet. This was agricultural diplomacy, and also deeply impressive patience. Let's drift next into the voyaging dimension, the part where gardeners became essential to exploration, migration, and settlement. Polynesians were legendary navigators. They traveled across the Pacific with a precision that still confuses meteorologists. And they didn't travel empty-handed. They brought plants, cuttings, root shoots, saplings, and yes, breadfruit. Transporting breadfruit wasn't easy. The plants were picky. They didn't like dry roots, too much salt spray, or rough handling. They were the divas of canoe cargo. So gardeners became crucial members of voyaging crews, responsible for keeping these precious plants alive during long journeys through open ocean. Imagine the calm determination required. Weeks at sea, storms, Sunday salt, rowdy crew members, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a gardener gently misting his breadfruit cuttings like, "If these die, so do our future food supplies. Please stop bumping this crate." When new islands were reached, the breadfruit trees were among the first things planted. They symbolized settling, belonging, continuity, and whoever planted the first breadfruit tree on a new island, that person held quiet prestige for generations. So when you see breadfruit groves in Polynesia, you're not just looking at agriculture. You're looking at migration paths, memory, survival, and the determination of gardeners who insisted on bringing their leafy responsibilities everywhere they went. Let's float closer to one of the most understated yet emotionally weighty responsibilities, teaching the next generation. Breadfruit knowledge wasn't written. It lived in conversation. A young apprentice followed the gardener around, listened, learned the subtle signals. How leaves curled in dry season winds. How bark changed texture before heavy fruiting. How the smell near the base of the tree could reveal fungal issues. 1,000 tiny details passed down quietly. The apprentice also learned the social side. Who needed extra fruit that season? Who recently suffered a loss? Who might need a small gift of early ripening fruit to mend an old grievance? Breadfruit wasn't just sustenance. It was emotional infrastructure. By the time the apprentice became the next gardener, he carried not just horticultural knowledge but also community memory. He knew the tree families, the pit storage histories, the old stories tied to each grove. He inherited the responsibility to keep the peace by keeping the fruit flowing. And so the role of the breadfruit gardener stayed steady through generations, sometimes noble, sometimes overlooked, but always essential. While other world cultures admired warriors, priests, nobles, or scholars, Polynesian societies quietly valued the man who kept the trees alive. His influence wasn't loud, but it was constant. A gentle form of leadership rooted in patience, observation, and the calm certainty that food, slow-growing, reliable food, held communities together better than any speech or threat. No thrones, no crowns, just roots in the ground and a lineage of caretakers who made sure everyone ate, season after season. And in the next chapter, we'll drift even deeper into the varieties themselves. The subtle differences. The reason some families bragged about having the good cultivar while others insisted theirs was the one the gods actually liked. Soft rivalries, quiet pride, and a surprising amount of botanical snobbery. All of it still centered around a tree that asked for nothing more than patience, and perhaps fewer teenage boys trying to shake the branches. Breadfruit might look like a single species of round, green, mildly lumpy carbohydrate, but in Polynesia it was never just breadfruit. It was a whole universe of varieties, subtle, ancient, sometimes suspiciously similar, yet fiercely claimed by different families as the best one, the softest one, or the one our ancestors personally preferred, so obviously it's superior. This wasn't open warfare. No one stormed groves or issued proclamations. It was a quiet rivalry, the sort conducted through raised eyebrows, murmured comments, and the occasional passive-aggressive gift of an inferior fruit. The gardener, of course, had to navigate all of this without losing his calm, because nothing ruins a peaceful agricultural society like two clans arguing about whether their cultivar was actually descended from a legendary canoe tree. So let's drift into this world of botanical prestige, the kind of royal drama Europe would have ruined by immediately marrying everyone to everyone else. Polynesians, more sensibly, just gave plants different names. To begin softly, imagine you're walking through a grove with a gardener on an ordinary morning. Sunlight filters through broad leaves. The fruit hangs low. Everything looks green and identical. And yet the gardener stops at the first tree and says something like, "This is the soft cultivar, good for baking, not good for storage." He walks 10 steps to the next tree. "This one stores well. Not good for feasts." 10 steps more. "This one ripens early. Good for sharing during canoe repairs." And on it goes. Tree after tree. Variety after variety. Each cultivar had a personality, a purpose, a place in the social fabric. Europe had aristocratic families with complicated lineages. Polynesia had plants with complicated lineages, which honestly feels healthier in the long run. Let's drift toward the way these varieties were named, because the names held stories. Some names described texture, some described color, some described mythic origins, and some were definitely assigned by people who were tired and out of ideas. You could find names meaning, the soft and fluffy one, the one the chief liked, the sweet one, the one the sea wind favors, the one you don't eat raw unless you enjoy regrets. And then there were the names referencing ancestors. "This is the breadfruit of so-and-so's canoe," the gardener would say. Or, "This tree's parent was carried by your great-great-grandmother on her voyage from the west." These weren't just botanical labels. They were genealogies tied to memory. Trees became ancestors in their own right, standing as living proof of a lineage that had survived storms, migrations, quarrels, and the occasional overconfident fisherman who tried to climb them. Every tree held history, and the gardener was the interpreter. Now let's float gently into the topic of cultivar prestige. Some cultivars were considered elite. Their fruit had just the right texture, just the right softness, just the right aroma when baked over stones. Owning a tree from one of these elite cultivars conferred quiet bragging rights, not the loud kind, but the softly smug kind families carried for generations. A family might say very casually, "Oh yes, that tree? It's from the ancestor who saved our canoe during the storm. Very special fruit. Our people have always preferred this one." Another family might respond with equal calm, "Ah, yes, but this cultivar is the one our chief always chose. Very prestigious. It stores beautifully. Our ancestors valued practicality." Then they would both smile politely at each other, and maintain that smile for decades. Because in a society that prized harmony, cultivar rivalry was a safe outlet. No swords, no political plots, just plant-based snobbery. Let's drift into a specific example now, because every island had at least one truly dramatic cultivar story, dramatic in the quietest possible way. On certain islands in the Society Islands group, there were prized cultivars said to have come from the earliest arrivals. These trees were treated like genealogical VIPs. They weren't just plants, they were legacies. If your family had a sapling descended from one of these original settlers' trees, you had a living symbol of seniority. Not something you flaunted loudly, because that would have disrupted the calm vibe, but something you might mention at the perfect moment during a discussion about feast contributions. "I suppose we can bring more, since our tree is one of the old ones," someone might say, with the calm tone of a person who knows that yes, everyone noticed the implication. The gardener? He had to navigate this with absolute neutrality. He couldn't show preference. He couldn't hint which cultivar he personally thought tasted like a bland sponge. He couldn't roll his eyes when someone insisted their fruit was the one that was better before the drought 50 years ago. He maintained peace by treating every cultivar like it mattered, because socially, it did. Let's drift next to the practical differences that made cultivars so important. Different trees fruited at different times. Some fruited early in the season, easing pressure on the storage pits. Others fruited late, giving the community something to look forward to. Some gave huge yields. Others gave small but consistent ones. Some were perfect for drying. Others made the best fermented paste. Some tasted terrible unless cooked in a very specific way known only to the elders. The combination of these characteristics formed a carefully balanced food system. It meant communities weren't reliant on one harvest window. They had early fruit, late fruit, storage fruit, feast fruit, travel fruit, and, in case of emergency, storm season fruit. This was quiet sophistication, environmental engineering through genetic preservation, a slow, methodical resilience plan that kept families stable for centuries. And the gardener? He remembered which cultivar did what. He kept track of which tree plus which season equaled which food supply. He guided pruning and grafting to maintain the balance. A poorly managed grove could mean shortages. A well-managed grove meant peace. And peace was always the goal. Let's float toward the role of storytelling in cultivar identity. Because yes, even the plants had stories. And many of those stories were emotional reminders of why certain trees were valued. One cultivar might be linked to an ancestor who saved children during a famine. Another might be tied to a family who generously shared fruit with canoe voyagers. Another might be associated with a marriage alliance, one sapling gifted from one clan to another to seal a bond. The stories persisted not because people needed dramatic legends, but because a tree's lineage mattered in social exchanges. When you gifted someone fruit, you were gifting the reputation of your tree. Imagine handing someone a bowl of cooked breadfruit and saying, essentially, this comes from the tree whose ancestor traveled with your ancestor during the Great Voyage. It wasn't just food. It was continuity, a soft, edible reminder that everyone was connected in ways deeper than they could see. Now let's drift into one of the gardener's trickiest responsibilities, ensuring cultivar diversity. If a single cultivar dominated the groves, the community became vulnerable to disease, to drought, to changes in soil conditions, to anything that could disrupt that one variety. So gardeners maintained a mosaic, a slow, steady patchwork of species, each with strengths, each with weaknesses, each occupying a specific place in the long-term food strategy. This required careful monitoring. If a certain cultivar began producing poorly, the gardener might graft a branch from a stronger tree. If a new sapling was planted, the gardener made sure it wasn't too close to a competing root system. If a storm damaged one variety, he planned compensations with the others. It was long-form problem-solving, the opposite of sudden crises or dramatic interventions. It was quiet course correction, season after season, generation after generation. Let's drift closer to the social consequences of owning rare varieties. Some families had trees that others envied. Not in a dangerous way, more in the way someone today might envy a neighbor's unusually productive mango tree. Rare cultivars weren't hoarded, but they were respected. Receiving fruit from one of these trees was an honor, and gifting fruit from one was a subtle flex. Imagine a feast. People gather around woven mats. Freshly cooked breadfruit releases steam, and someone mentions, barely above a whisper, this is from their famous tree. Everyone eats politely. No one reacts dramatically, but the respect is felt. You don't need loud reactions to understand prestige. In fact, Polynesian culture often preferred the unspoken. Quiet acknowledgement, calm appreciation, the gardener observing from a distance, knowing exactly which fruit came from which tree. Let's float next to one of the soft ironies in all of this. To outsiders, breadfruit trees look interchangeable, just green spheres on big branches. But to the communities depending on them, the trees were individuals. A gardener might talk about trees the way other people talk about relatives. This one is reliable. This one is temperamental. This one grows well but tastes bland. This one produces beautifully after storms. Humanizing the trees wasn't sentimental, it was practical. It helped gardeners remember hundreds of variables. And when a tree finally aged beyond productivity, the sadness wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, accepting, the end of a long relationship. The gardener harvested the last fruit, planted new shoots, and ensured the lineage continued. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was wasted. Change happened with the calm inevitability of tides. So as the cultivar web stretched across islands and families, it created a network of relationships between plants, people, land, and memory. Not a dramatic network. Not one filled with sudden betrayals or rousing speeches. Just a steady, peaceful connectedness. The kind that made breadfruit more than food. It became a cultural anchor, a genealogical map, a system of quiet status, and a foundation for social balance. In the next chapter, we'll drift into the ritual and symbolic layer, the ceremonies, the taboos, and the gentle beliefs surrounding breadfruit. How people treated the tree not just as sustenance but as a being with purpose and dignity. A calm world where even picking a fruit required intention, where the gardener's hands carried ritual weight, and where the tree stood as both a provider and a silent elder in the community. In Polynesian societies, breadfruit was not merely a plant. It was quietly sacred, not in the sense of grand temples or dramatic ceremonies. Those were for the gods whose names people feared to speak. Breadfruit was sacred in the soft, everyday way that touches your life without demanding fanfare. It provided, it sustained, it reminded people of the generations who had tended it. And, most importantly, it required respect. The gardener, already a subtle figure of authority, also became the keeper of these rituals. He understood when to pick, how to handle the fruit, and which practices ensured the tree's continued cooperation. Not compliance, exactly, trees were not tyrants, but cooperation. Because a neglected or improperly harvested tree would yield poorly. And a poorly yielding tree could ripple across households and clans. So let's float into some of the daily, quietly ceremonial practices. Harvesting breadfruit was never rushed. It began with careful observation. A gardener would notice the faint color change, the subtle give when pressed, the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. When the tree signaled readiness, the act of picking was deliberate. Each fruit was handled individually, often with bare hands, and sometimes with a long pole tipped with a hook. The goal was not speed. It was precision, care, and minimizing bruising, because a damaged fruit was an insult to the tree and, by extension, to the ancestors. Some islands practiced soft words while harvesting. Whispered thanks or muttered phrases of respect acknowledged the tree's contribution. It was as if the fruit itself could understand gratitude, and, culturally speaking, it did. The young apprentices learned this as part of their silent education. Never rush a tree, never pluck carelessly, and always recognize the slow generosity of nature. Tied to these practices were taboos. Not severe, life-threatening taboos, but gentle social rules that shaped behavior. For example, certain trees were restricted to specific families or individuals. No one outside that group could harvest without permission. Disregarding this wasn't just a minor breach of etiquette. It was considered a social faux pas. In a world where harmony mattered more than conquest, offending a tree, or its guardian, was akin to upsetting the balance of the community. Some trees had seasonal restrictions. Certain months were off-limits for cutting fruit, pruning, or even climbing. These were quiet rituals tied to the lunar calendar, local weather patterns, and the tree's natural cycles. Ignoring them didn't summon lightning bolts. It just reduced yields and irritated neighbors. And in a calm society, irritation was the loudest trouble you could get away with. The ritual significance also extended to planting. When a new sapling was introduced, the gardener often performed a soft ceremony. Leaves were laid around the base. Water from a special spring might be sprinkled. Words of encouragement were whispered. These gestures weren't dramatic. No dancing or shouting. Just a slow, meditative acknowledgement of a new life entering the village. The sapling would eventually inherit stories, lineage, and social weight. A tree planted by one family could later feed another, and that transfer carried quiet symbolic meaning. Gift-giving with breadfruit was more than generosity. It was an act of diplomacy, memory, and continuity. Even everyday tasks carried ritual undertones. When transferring fruit to the fermentation pits, the gardener followed an almost ceremonial sequence. Inspecting each fruit, gently preparing leaves for lining, placing fruit with deliberate spacing, covering it carefully, adding layers of protection and moisture. Every step was slow, deliberate, and thoughtful. It ensured food security and demonstrated respect for the tree, the labor involved, and the families who depended on it. This attention to detail may sound tedious, and it was. But in a society where the pace of life was naturally slower, this tedium became a form of meditation. Harvesting, storing, and monitoring breadfruit was a soft rhythm that connected humans to generations past and future. Let's drift toward taboos associated with social behavior around the tree. For instance, you weren't supposed to argue loudly or behave aggressively near a sacred tree. Even disagreements over distribution were handled calmly, often at a respectful distance. Loud voices, rough handling, or careless gestures risked disrupting the spiritual equilibrium of the grove. Children learned this early. A small slip, a branch snapped by accident, a fruit dropped carelessly, prompted a gentle lecture from the gardener. No punishment, no public humiliation, just correction, explanation, and encouragement to respect the rhythm of life that the tree represented. Elders often reinforced these lessons, because in this context, patience, calmness, and mindfulness weren't abstract virtues. They were practical tools for survival. And breadfruit trees, long-lived and steady, were excellent teachers. Breadfruit also served symbolic purposes during feasts and communal gatherings. At large village events, a bowl of breadfruit could symbolize continuity, abundance, and respect for the community. Certain cultivars might be reserved for chiefs or visiting dignitaries. Presenting fruit in a careful order conveyed messages. Here is generosity, here is respect, here is memory of your ancestors. Even minor differences mattered. A slightly softer variety might be offered to children, a denser, well-preserved cultivar to elders. These subtle distinctions communicated care, attention, and understanding of social roles. And because Polynesian society prized harmony over spectacle, these gestures were never loud. They were quiet affirmations of the community's interconnections. Now let's drift into the gardener's personal relationship with the tree, which was simultaneously practical and reflective. A gardener often spent decades with the same grove. He knew each tree individually. Some trees were reliable. Some were temperamental. Some produced uneven yields for mysterious reasons. He observed these quirks, adjusted techniques, and passed the knowledge to apprentices. This long-term relationship cultivated a form of calm expertise. Unlike rulers who might change advisors every season, gardeners maintained continuity. Their daily attention shaped yields, stabilized food distribution, and ensured social balance. And emotionally, it was a form of quiet companionship. Trees responded, in their slow, organic way, to care. They rewarded patience and diligence. And the gardener, in return, found a sense of purpose and calm authority. Let's float toward apprenticeship rituals, because they were as gentle as the trees themselves. Apprentices didn't merely learn which leaves signaled ripeness. They learned the ethics of care, how to handle fruit respectfully, how to anticipate the needs of families, how to maintain balance between generosity and necessity. The learning process was slow, observational, meditative. A young apprentice might spend hours quietly following the gardener, noting subtle changes in color, texture, smell, and sound. Mistakes were corrected gently. Lessons were reinforced through storytelling, whispered wisdom, and example rather than through coercion. The apprenticeship ended only when the student could confidently tend the grove, manage storage pits, and navigate social expectations. In a sense, a new gardener was only considered competent when he could carry the calm weight of responsibility for both trees and people without visible tension. Let's drift to one final layer, the spiritual continuity and subtle philosophy around breadfruit. Breadfruit trees lived long, sometimes outliving gardeners, sometimes outliving entire family branches. They symbolized continuity, life stretching across generations, stability amid storms, droughts, and human disagreements. When a tree finally declined, it wasn't mourned with dramatic rituals. The gardener harvested the remaining fruit, replanted new shoots, and prepared the next generation of trees. This cycle of life was acknowledged softly. Acceptance, rather than grief, was the cultural norm. The trees were quiet teachers. They imparted lessons in patience, foresight, and respect. They encouraged communities to operate with slow deliberation, careful distribution, and subtle acknowledgement of social bonds. Even today, when walking through traditional groves, one might notice the unspoken order. Which trees are cared for first? Which are protected? Which are respected silently? Breadfruit was never just a plant. It was a framework for life, for relationships, for memory and social harmony. And at the center of it all, the gardener moved calmly, quietly, meditatively, ensuring that both fruit and people thrived. In the next chapter, we'll drift into the voyaging and migration dimension in more detail, exploring how gardeners became essential to moving entire communities across the vast Pacific. We'll see how breadfruit trees weren't just rooted in place. They were passengers, legacies, and living maps of Polynesian exploration. By now, it might feel like breadfruit is just quietly sitting there, shading the village, producing starchy meals, and offering gentle lessons in patience. But Polynesian breadfruit had another, surprisingly dynamic role. It traveled. Slowly, methodically, thoughtfully, but it traveled. And with it, gardeners became unspoken custodians of entire migrations. Polynesians were among the greatest navigators in human history. Canoes crossed thousands of miles of open ocean with no instruments beyond stars, winds, swells, birds, and a finely tuned intuition honed over generations. And wherever they went, survival demanded more than just a canoe and a good sense of direction. You needed food. And not just temporary provisions. You needed staples that could sustain life on an island for years to come. Enter the gardener. And enter the breadfruit. The breadfruit tree was surprisingly mobile, at least for a tree. Not seeds, not fruit, the gardener transported saplings, cuttings, and root shoots. These delicate, living packages required attention. Exposure to too much sun, salt spray, or neglect could doom them before they ever reached their new home. And failure meant a community arriving on a barren island with nothing to eat beyond fish and coconuts. So gardeners became essential members of voyaging crews. They were slow-moving, careful specialists, often quietly positioned near the middle or rear of the canoe, monitoring saplings in woven baskets or lightly secured in containers. While the sailors adjusted sails, paddled through swells, and argued about directions, the gardener tended the plants with a calm authority. Imagine the tension. Not dramatic, adrenaline-filled tension. The soft, simmering anxiety of someone silently thinking, "Do not let these die. Do not let these die." Because if the breadfruit failed, the new settlement would struggle immediately, and everyone would remember the gardener's hands, whether kindly or critically. Preparation for transport was a slow, meticulous process. Cuttings were chosen from mature, productive trees. Roots were wrapped in moist leaves. Shoots were carefully aligned to prevent breakage. Sometimes multiple cuttings were brought just in case. Saltwater exposure was minimized. And once on the canoe, these saplings were shielded, gently monitored, and occasionally spoken to, not because the trees could understand words, but because the gardener needed a rhythm, a mental rehearsal of calm attentiveness. During the voyage, storms and rough seas were inevitable. Canoes pitched and rolled. Water splashed. Birds circled overhead. And in the midst of it, the gardener remained steady, calmly repositioning saplings, ensuring that none were crushed or desiccated. It was a slow, meditative responsibility. No dramatic heroics. No yelling. Just unbroken vigilance. Arrival at a new island brought another stage of careful ritual. Before planting, the gardener assessed the soil. He observed the microclimates, shaded spots, sunlit slopes, well-drained areas, slightly elevated ground for protection against floods. Placement mattered, not just for survival but for long-term growth and yield. Some communities even maintained subtle social hierarchies in planting. Certain families' saplings went in prominent locations near water sources or village centers, signaling ancestral priority and social respect. The act of planting was deliberate. Each sapling received its own space. Leaves or local materials were used to protect roots. Watering was careful, and soft words, as in village ritual, were often murmured. A new tree was not just a food source, it was a social promise, a living emblem of continuity, and a legacy of the gardeners who had shepherded it across hundreds or thousands of miles. It is important to note that breadfruit was not merely functional on these voyages. It was also symbolic. Traveling thousands of miles to an unknown island could be frightening. Canoes were small, storms were frequent, and provisions were finite. Breadfruit represented stability. It symbolized hope. The presence of a sapling guaranteed that the settlers would not start over entirely empty-handed. The act of caring for the saplings during the journey also created a meditative rhythm for the gardener, reinforcing a sense of control and calm, even when the ocean was anything but calm. And in a society where stories and memory were paramount, the gardener became a living link between the old homeland and the new settlement. He carried knowledge of cultivars, growth cycles, storage techniques, and ancestral practices. Without him, the voyage might have succeeded physically, but culturally, it would have been impoverished. Once the new island was settled, the gardener's responsibilities expanded further. Planting was just the beginning. Maintaining the young trees was essential. Saplings were fragile. They required careful watering, protection from wind, attention to soil conditions, and gradual acclimatization. The first few seasons were critical. Too little attention, and the trees failed. Too much attention, and the plants could become dependent on unnatural interventions. Gardeners also oversaw the social allocation of these new trees. Certain families received the first fruit, while others waited. Some trees were reserved for storage pits. Others were offered to visiting clans. These allocations were subtle forms of governance. Not coercive, not loud, but quietly effective in maintaining social balance. Let's drift now to the long-term implications of these voyages. A single gardener transporting breadfruit could shape the future of an entire settlement. Successful cultivation meant food security. Food security meant population growth. Population growth allowed for social stability. Social stability allowed cultural practices to endure. And all of this depended on slow, careful, deliberate attention to one plant species. The gardener's expertise ensured continuity. By transporting multiple cultivars, he prevented monoculture vulnerability. By planting strategically, he guaranteed ecological balance. By overseeing storage and allocation, he maintained social harmony. In short, he quietly ran the settlement's survival, using nothing but patience, knowledge, and horticultural skill. Now, let's consider the subtle challenges of voyaging. Salt spray could desiccate leaves. Heat could cook roots. Storms could topple saplings. Canoe decks were limited in space. Crews were active and bustling. The gardener had to work amidst all this, sometimes at awkward angles, always maintaining composure. One misstep could kill a tree and jeopardize the settlement. And yet, despite these pressures, the gardener moved calmly. No shouting, no dramatic gestures. Just steady hands, quiet monitoring, and soft adjustments. It was an expertise born of generations, of knowing the temperament of each cultivar, the habits of the sea, and the rhythms of human communities. Once trees began to establish themselves in the new settlement, the gardener's influence extended further. He became a teacher. He instructed children and apprentices. He passed down knowledge of soil types, rainfall patterns, pruning techniques, storage methods, and social allocation. Each lesson reinforced continuity, ensuring that the next generation could maintain the delicate balance of agriculture, community, and ritual. Because in Polynesian societies, the survival of a settlement was inseparable from the gardener's wisdom. Not the chief's authority, not the warrior's strength, not even the navigator's skill. Breadfruit was life, and the gardener safeguarded it. There is a quiet irony here. Europe's great migrations and conquests often focused on armies, swords, and borders. Polynesia's great migrations depended on patience, plants, and subtle social management. One person's calm diligence with a handful of saplings could secure the future of an entire community. This was not heroic in the loud sense. There were no chronicles filled with dramatic speeches or epic battles. But it was heroic in the understated, methodical, and endlessly patient sense. Every voyage succeeded or failed, in part, because someone understood the tree better than anyone else. And so the gardener became a figure of soft authority, quietly shaping settlements. The canoe arrived. Saplings were planted. Villagers watched, often unconsciously, as patterns of social structure, ritual, and agricultural wisdom unfolded around them. And in the decades that followed, those patterns endured thanks to careful planting, meticulous care, and patient observation. By the time the new grove was established, it carried layers of meaning. Practical, food for years to come. Social, allocating fruit, maintaining harmony. Symbolic, hope, continuity, connection to the ancestral homeland. Educational, lessons for the next generation of gardeners. And the gardener? He had completed the voyage, managed the new settlement, and quietly ensured that the clan would thrive. And then, when a storm passed or the sun dipped below the horizon, he would sit, perhaps under the shade of a young sapling, and simply observe. No applause. No fanfare. Just the calm satisfaction of knowing that generations to come would eat, live, and remember because he moved carefully, patiently, and quietly across the ocean with a handful of trees. In the next chapter, we'll drift into the everyday lives of the gardeners themselves, their routines, small pleasures, social interactions, and subtle challenges. The quiet personal lives behind the essential work of moving, planting, and tending breadfruit. By now, we've drifted across groves, through cultivars, rituals, and ocean voyages. But gardeners were not mythical figures. They were humans with routines, quirks, and subtle personal dramas. Their work was essential, yes, but it was also embedded in the gentle rhythms of daily life, a mix of care, observation, and quiet social navigation. Let's drift into the early mornings. The gardener rose before most of the village stirred. The sky was soft, light diffused through the thin clouds above. He might not have coffee, but the world had its own slow caffeine. The sound of leaves moving, birds calling, and the occasional rustle of a fruit shifting in the breeze. This was a world that demanded calm attention, not panic or haste. His first task was inspection. Walking among the trees, he would feel the soil, tap the fruit, check leaves for pests, and note anything unusual. Sometimes a tree would disappoint him. A leaf curled oddly, a fruit lagged behind its usual schedule. And sometimes, quietly, he would chuckle at human tendencies mirrored in the trees. A temperamental tree could seem almost spoiled, a slow fruit the embodiment of stubbornness he might recognize in certain villagers. Work was interwoven with social responsibility. Gardeners were mediators. A young girl might grumble that her household's portion was too small. An elder might insist that a tree belonged to his branch alone. A visiting relative might arrive unexpectedly, expecting fruit. The gardener handled these disputes with calm neutrality. Not authoritarian commands, not theatrical displays of power, just measured judgment based on precedent, knowledge, and sometimes subtle persuasion. He might suggest, perhaps we can share the early ripening fruit from the southern grove this week, and everyone accepted it, because they trusted him. The quiet authority of experience outweighed any formal title. And yes, sometimes he faced minor annoyances. Mischievous children, overzealous helpers, or a neighbor's curiosity could complicate routines. But gardeners had patience in abundance. Distractions were met with gentle corrections and, occasionally, resigned sighs. Let's float into the personal routines of gardeners beyond tree care. They maintained small personal gardens, taro, sweet potatoes, or yam patches, but these were supplementary. Breadfruit groves demanded attention first. Meals were simple, often prepared early, and sometimes shared with apprentices. Conversations were calm, instructional, and slow-moving, echoing the rhythm of tending the trees themselves. They observed seasonal markers: the first rains, the migration of birds, the flowering of certain plants. Each signal could subtly influence how the grove was managed. A particularly wet season meant adjusting pruning schedules. An unexpected dry spell might require extra attention to roots and soil. Life was a continuous negotiation with nature. And yes, gardeners found quiet pleasure in observing the results of their work. A tree producing abundantly brought a subtle, wordless satisfaction. Seeing a young apprentice handle a sapling correctly reinforced a sense of legacy. Even minor improvements in soil or fruit texture were quietly celebrated. These joys were low-key, meditative, almost unnoticeable unless you were paying attention. Socially, gardeners were respected but not ostentatious. They weren't chiefs. They weren't warriors. They didn't command troops or issue edicts. But they were integral. The village depended on their foresight, calm judgment, and continuity. Invitations to feasts or community gatherings were often extended politely. Children were taught to observe them as exemplars of patience. Elders consulted them for advice, not in fear but in trust. And there was humor. Gentle, quiet humor. A gardener might mutter about a stubborn tree as though it were a lazy cousin, or laugh softly when an apprentice misjudged the weight of a fruit. These were small moments, rarely dramatic, but they reminded the community that gardeners were human. Let's drift toward training apprentices more closely. Apprenticeships were lengthy. Months, sometimes years, of observation before hands-on practice. Young learners followed the gardener through dew-soaked groves, watched the tap of fruit, and memorized which trees ripened when. They learned the social dimensions as well: who received fruit first, how to mediate complaints, when to offer advice or remain silent. Mistakes were corrected gently. A dropped fruit or misjudged pruning was not punished harshly. Instead, it became a teaching moment, paired with explanation and calm guidance. Patience was a hallmark of the role, not just for the trees but for the humans in the ecosystem. Over time, apprentices became extensions of the gardener himself. Eventually, they assumed partial responsibility for portions of the grove, always under careful observation. The slow transfer of knowledge was both practical and symbolic. Continuity of care ensured the grove's survival and the social stability it supported. Let's drift into the quieter challenges gardeners faced. Weather was unpredictable. Droughts could stress trees. Floods could erode soil. Pests could emerge suddenly. A gardener had to anticipate these risks, often with minimal tools and only long experience to guide decisions. Mistakes were costly, but not dramatically. They were measured in reduced yields, minor disputes, or subtle disappointment among the community. Disease management was part intuition, part observation. A leaf curling too early, discoloration along the fruit skin, or slightly unusual patterns of growth could indicate underlying problems. The gardener addressed these gently, pruning, repositioning, adjusting water, and consulting elders or previous notes. And all of this was intertwined with human relationships. Perhaps a family was impatient for fruit, or another family had contributed labor but felt overlooked. Gardeners had to balance cultivation and diplomacy simultaneously, always maintaining a calm demeanor. Now let's float toward personal reflection and quiet contemplation. Gardeners spent a lot of time alone among the trees. Early morning walks, silent pruning sessions, or evenings watching leaves move in the wind. These moments provided time for reflection. Observing life cycles in trees could naturally shift perspective on human life. Patience, care, and acceptance became embodied practice rather than abstract principle. Some gardeners composed oral histories, recounting stories of old groves, previous migrations, and cultivar origins. Others simply observed and stored these stories in memory. Either way, they became custodians of culture, quietly linking past, present, and future. Let's drift into the minor pleasures that marked a gardener's life. A perfectly ripe fruit offered taste and satisfaction. Watching a sapling survive its first season brought calm pride. Soft breezes, rainfall, bird calls, and the rhythm of village life provided sensory comfort. Conversations with apprentices or quiet exchanges with neighbors created subtle social bonds. Even small acts, adjusting a leaf, rearranging a pit, or checking soil, carried meditative weight. Life was not dramatic. It was slow, rhythmic, and deliberate. And yet, in this quiet, essential work, the gardeners found dignity, purpose, and connection. Finally, let's consider legacy. Gardeners rarely sought fame. They were rarely named in stories or songs in the way chiefs or voyagers were. But their influence was profound. Each tree they planted, each sapling transported, each apprentice trained ensured survival. Their work shaped diets, settlement success, and social harmony across generations. When a gardener's hands no longer tended the groves, his apprentices continued the rhythm. The trees persisted, communities thrived, and subtle authority quietly passed on. It was a legacy measured not in wealth or titles, but in life sustained, stories preserved, and food shared. Even centuries later, when observing ancient groves, one can still trace the gardener's calm diligence. The arrangement of trees, the placement of storage pits, the patterns of cultivation. His influence lingers quietly, invisibly, yet undeniably. Breadfruit gardeners lived slow, attentive lives. They navigated subtle social complexities, environmental uncertainty, and long-term planning with patience and care. They taught apprentices, mediated disputes, and ensured survival. And through it all, they maintained calm, quiet authority, the understated heartbeat of Polynesian life. In the next chapter, we'll drift into the subtle tensions and occasional disasters, storms, crop failures, and social disputes that gardeners had to resolve, always quietly, always patiently. Life among breadfruit groves was mostly calm, rhythmic, and slow-moving. But even in the most harmonious island settlements, nature occasionally reminded everyone that control was, at best, partial. Storms arrived unannounced. Crops failed unexpectedly. Pests multiplied. And the gardener, calm though he might be, had to navigate these small catastrophes with patience and subtle authority. Unlike the dramatic disasters we read about in history books, battles, revolutions, dynastic coups, these were quiet, persistent challenges. They were the kind of difficulties that required careful thought, long-term planning, and gentle social management rather than swords or shouting. And in the slow world of breadfruit cultivation, even minor setbacks could ripple through a community if not handled correctly. Storms were the most immediate and visible threat. A sudden tropical squall could strip leaves, knock fruit to the ground, or erode soil. Canoes were sometimes tied up in preparation, villagers secured their homes, but the groves remained exposed. After the storm passed, the gardener would survey the damage. Fallen fruit was carefully collected, if usable. Broken branches were pruned with attention to both tree health and aesthetics. Soil displacement was slowly corrected. This was not heroic action in the dramatic sense. There were no grand speeches, no celebratory accounts of victory over the tempest. The work was methodical: survey, assess, correct, protect. The gardener's calm presence reassured the community. Children learned patience by watching him move slowly from tree to tree, adjusting leaves, and quietly rebalancing what nature had disrupted. Setbacks sometimes arrived in subtler forms: pests and disease. Insects could burrow into fruit, fungi could discolor leaves, and mold could invade storage pits. Gardeners had long-term strategies, often based on observation and tradition rather than formal science. Certain leaves might be laid beneath the fruit to discourage pests. Water management was adjusted to reduce mold. Minor pruning removed affected sections. Even when these measures failed, the response was never dramatic. The gardener did not panic. He simply adjusted, observed, and planned for the next cycle. Small crop losses were absorbed quietly. The rhythm of life continued, slower but not derailed. Let's drift towards social complications caused by setbacks. When a particular grove underperformed, families noticed. Complaints arose. Requests for redistribution of fruit were made. Expectations needed adjustment. Here, the gardener functioned as a mediator, not a judge or enforcer, but a quietly persuasive coordinator. He might explain, "This tree struggled last season. We can balance the yield by supplementing with fruit from the southern grove." Conflicts were rarely loud. Village harmony depended on subtle communication, patience, and precedent. A mismanaged crop could easily become a social headache, but the gardener's calm handling minimized tension. This is one reason why his role carried both ecological and social weight. Sometimes, setbacks were cumulative. A weak storm followed by a dry season, followed by pest infestation, could combine to produce stress on multiple cultivars simultaneously. The gardener then faced layered challenges. Immediate repairs were prioritized. Critical trees received extra attention. Young saplings were protected. Storage pits were checked for spoilage. And soft, gentle communications ensured families understood why some fruit would be delayed or distributed differently. These layered challenges also demanded careful observation. Gardeners noted patterns: which cultivars survived drought, which resisted pests, which soil patches recovered quickly. Over time, this knowledge shaped planting decisions, pruning schedules, and even the subtle social hierarchies tied to groves. Let's drift toward ritual responses to adversity. Even minor crises carried cultural dimensions. A grove damaged by a storm might be approached with whispered respect or small offerings. Not as appeasement in a dramatic sense, but as acknowledgement of life's unpredictability and the gardener's role in mediating its consequences. Community rituals were sometimes integrated. Children might help replant fallen saplings, learning patience and care. Elders might recite stories about ancestors who endured worse, offering perspective and continuity. The gardener's work intersected with these soft rituals, reinforcing social cohesion and a shared understanding that setbacks were temporary and recoverable. Let's float toward the gardener's own mindset during disasters. Unlike chiefs, navigators, or warriors, the gardener did not rely on authority, force, or charisma. His power was in observation, foresight, and patience. He accepted that some damage was inevitable. He adjusted expectations, balanced resources, and maintained calm. Sometimes he might feel quiet frustration at the loss of a prized cultivar. A tree that had produced reliably for decades might falter. But his response was never dramatic grief. Instead, he applied careful attention: pruning, soil adjustment, shading, and protective measures. He monitored young replacements and ensured continuity of the grove. There was a subtle irony here. The gardener faced constant high-stakes responsibility without ever receiving dramatic recognition. Success was measured not in applause, but in continuity, subtle social harmony, and quiet yield. Let's drift toward long-term planning as resilience. Gardeners maintained diversity in their groves precisely to buffer against unpredictable events. Multiple cultivars ensured that if one failed, others could sustain the community. Planting patterns were designed to protect against erosion, wind, and flooding. Saplings were rotated and transplanted strategically. Knowledge of past setbacks informed present decisions. This slow, careful approach was the key to survival. Polynesian communities thrived across scattered islands with varying conditions, thanks in large part to these quiet strategies. The gardener's foresight, combined with patient observation and subtle social authority, created a resilient system. Now let's drift into subtle human tensions caused by setbacks. Even the calmest village experienced minor disputes. Which household received the first ripe fruit? Did one family contribute more labor than another? Should a rare cultivar be shared or reserved? The gardener navigated these with neutrality and gentle authority. He could point to precedent, reference past practice, or use subtle persuasion. Sometimes he simply deferred to elders or clan customs. Always, the goal was minimal conflict and continuity of care. Unlike dramatic historical conflicts, these disputes were resolved quietly. The community's stability relied on patience, negotiation, and observation rather than dramatic enforcement. Let's float toward recovery strategies after disasters. When a storm flattened part of a grove or a disease struck, the gardener implemented a layered response. Salvage what could be salvaged. Protect young or vulnerable trees. Replant using preserved saplings. Adjust storage and distribution plans. Teach apprentices the lessons of the event. Recovery was never quick. It was steady, measured, and always mindful of the social and ecological balance. Even in disaster, there was room for quiet observation and learning. A gardener could study which cultivars rebounded fastest, which pruning techniques worked best, which soil patches resisted erosion. This knowledge informed future planting, allocation, and voyage planning. Every setback was a slow, iterative lesson in resilience. And importantly, it reinforced the gardener's authority, not through power, but through expertise. Others relied on him not because he demanded it, but because he understood subtle patterns in plants, weather, and human behavior better than anyone else. Finally, let's drift toward the gentle legacy of gardeners through setbacks. Storms passed, crops recovered, communities endured, and generations of knowledge accumulated quietly, embedded in practices, rituals, and social norms. Gardeners shaped these outcomes through slow, deliberate action, not heroics. Even centuries later, when looking at groves, one can trace this history: the careful spacing of trees, the preserved cultivars, and the subtle patterns of care. The gardener's calm diligence persists invisibly, yet undeniably, in the landscape. In a sense, every successful breadfruit harvest, every thriving community, every well-tended sapling is a quiet testament to these patient figures. They faced storms, setbacks, and social complexities not with force or drama, but with observation, care, and enduring patience. In the next chapter, we'll drift into the intergenerational wisdom, how gardeners trained successors, preserved ancestral knowledge, and ensured that the calm continuity of breadfruit care spanned centuries. As we drift further into the quiet world of Polynesian breadfruit gardeners, it becomes clear that their work was never just about tending trees in isolation. It was about continuity. Continuity across seasons, generations, and entire communities. The gardener was part teacher, part historian, part social mediator, and part strategist. His legacy was not measured in monuments or titles, but in knowledge carefully preserved and passed down. Let's begin with apprenticeship, the slow and deliberate process by which wisdom traveled. Unlike the rapid, flashy methods of modern instruction, apprentices learned by observation, repetition, and subtle guidance. A young apprentice did not receive a manual or explicit instructions. Instead, he followed the gardener through groves, mimicking movements, noting which branches were pruned first, how leaves were inspected, and when fruit was considered ripe. Mistakes were expected, even encouraged in a gentle way. Dropped fruit, misjudged pruning, or minor oversights became lessons. Corrections were subtle, accompanied by calm explanations. Over time, the apprentice internalized both practical skill and the social rhythms that surrounded breadfruit cultivation. Observation was paramount. A gardener might stand silently under a tree for hours, noting the slightest color change, the firmness of a leaf, or the pattern of fruit growth. Apprentices learned patience in this way. They saw that knowledge was cumulative, built over decades of careful attention. The rhythm of observation itself was a lesson. Time was not rushed. Seasons were marked not by calendars but by subtle cues in soil, foliage, and weather. Apprentices absorbed these rhythms naturally, learning that understanding came from sustained, calm attention rather than hurried instruction. Stories and oral history were also critical tools. Gardeners recounted the lineage of specific cultivars, the voyages that transported them, and the families who had nurtured them across generations. These stories were not dramatic epics. They were soft, flowing narratives that embedded technical knowledge, social norms, and cultural memory. For example, an apprentice might hear, "This cultivar traveled with our ancestors across the open sea. Notice how its leaves differ slightly from the grove near the southern cliff. These differences matter in wind exposure and storage. Always remember this when planting or pruning." The story and the lesson were inseparable. History was practical, and practice was historical. The apprentice absorbed both without realizing that he was accumulating centuries of wisdom. Let's float toward ritualized teaching methods. Certain tasks were imbued with subtle ceremonial weight. Pruning a young sapling for the first time, harvesting initial fruits from a new grove, or transplanting a cutting from a parent tree often involved deliberate sequences of action, accompanied by soft words acknowledging ancestry and continuity. These rituals were not grand or ostentatious. There were no public celebrations. Instead, each act reinforced mindfulness, respect for the tree, and recognition of interconnected responsibilities. An apprentice internalized these cues over time, learning that every movement in the grove carried both practical and social significance. The passing of knowledge also included problem-solving strategies. Gardeners faced unpredictable challenges: storms, pests, soil shifts, or disease outbreaks. Apprentices learned to assess situations calmly, observe the affected areas, and implement incremental interventions. Each response was measured, deliberate, and informed by prior experience. For instance, if a sapling wilted unexpectedly, the apprentice would be guided to check soil moisture, leaf color, root placement, and microclimate. Decisions were made slowly, weighing consequences across weeks and seasons. Fast, panicked action was rare. Calm, informed observation was the norm. Let's drift to the subtler social lessons embedded in intergenerational training. Gardeners taught apprentices not only horticultural skills but also social navigation. Breadfruit groves were intertwined with family hierarchies, communal obligations, and ceremonial expectations. An apprentice learned which families received fruit first, how to resolve disputes over yield, and when to remain silent or speak softly. These lessons were never spelled out formally. They were absorbed through participation and example. A misstep might require gentle correction or a quiet explanation. Over time, the apprentice developed an intuitive understanding of social balance, calibrated to the rhythms of breadfruit life and village harmony. Now, let's float toward long-term memory and record-keeping. Before written records, memory was everything. Gardeners memorized cultivars, planting sequences, pruning schedules, storage rotations, and allocation patterns. They also retained knowledge of historical events, migrations, and previous crop failures. Apprentices learned to internalize this information gradually. They remembered which trees came from which ancestors, how storms had affected yields, and which techniques had succeeded or failed in specific conditions. Knowledge became embodied, inseparable from daily practice. This slow, cumulative memory system ensured that even if a gardener passed away unexpectedly, the community's knowledge survived. The apprentice could continue tending the grove with minimal disruption, maintaining both food security and social stability. Let's drift into the emotional dimension of intergenerational transfer. Gardeners developed quiet attachments to their apprentices. A successful pupil represented not only the survival of cultivars but the survival of wisdom itself. Subtle pride and satisfaction accompanied each minor achievement: a correctly pruned branch, a healthy sapling, or a successful harvest after a challenging season. Failures were handled with gentle guidance rather than reproach. A mismanaged crop became an opportunity to reinforce observation, patience, and adaptive strategies. Emotional stability, calm attention, and continuity were taught as naturally as pruning techniques or harvesting methods. Let's float toward legacy and continuity. Gardeners were aware that their work spanned lifetimes. They shaped the future quietly through cultivation, training, and careful observation. Each sapling planted, each cutting transported, each lesson imparted carried echoes into the next generation. Success was measured in subtle ways: groves that thrived, communities that remained harmonious, apprentices who matured into competent gardeners. Recognition was quiet. Satisfaction was private. But the influence was enduring. Even centuries later, groves arranged according to traditional practices testify to this careful stewardship. The spacing of trees, the allocation of cultivars, and the placement of storage pits all reflect decisions made slowly, deliberately, and with awareness of both nature and society. Let's drift toward the philosophical underpinnings of intergenerational wisdom. Knowledge was treated as living, adaptable, and relational. Gardeners understood that each tree, each season, and each apprentice was unique. Methods were not rigidly enforced. Adjustments were made according to observation, circumstance, and accumulated experience. This approach encouraged humility and patience. Gardeners recognized that control was partial, but influence could be exercised thoughtfully. Apprentices absorbed this mindset, learning that subtlety, calm attention, and respect for complexity were more powerful than force or haste. Finally, let's consider the cumulative impact of this slow transmission. Over generations, Polynesian societies maintained resilient agricultural systems, social cohesion, and cultural continuity. Breadfruit groves were not just food sources, they were living archives of human ingenuity, patience, and social intelligence. Gardeners, often unnoticed in broader histories, were essential to this resilience. Their slow, deliberate work, combined with thoughtful training of apprentices, ensured that communities could survive voyages, storms, and seasonal fluctuations. Knowledge flowed seamlessly from one generation to the next, quietly safeguarding life and culture. Even today, when observing traditional groves, one can sense the imprint of intergenerational wisdom: the careful arrangement of trees, the diversity of cultivars, and the subtle social organization reflected in planting and harvesting patterns. Each tree is a testament not only to ecological knowledge but to the patient, continuous labor of gardeners who valued calm, observation, and continuity above all else. In the next chapter, we'll drift into the broader cultural and symbolic significance of breadfruit across Polynesia, how it shaped community identity, ceremonies, and the very way people understood their connection to land and ancestors. By now, we've floated through groves, voyages, rituals, and the quiet personal lives of gardeners. But breadfruit was never merely practical. It occupied a subtle, pervasive role in Polynesian culture, shaping social identity, community cohesion, and the symbolic understanding of life, continuity, and the natural world. Its significance was slow, quiet, and deeply embedded, the kind of influence that whispers rather than shouts. Breadfruit and community identity. Every village had its groves. Some were communal, tended by several families together. Others were allocated to specific lineages. The layout, the care, and the distribution of fruit became markers of belonging and status, but in understated ways. Unlike dramatic monuments or ceremonial buildings, breadfruit groves were living symbols of cohesion and social order. The act of caring for the trees communicated values: patience, attentiveness, and respect for tradition. Villagers learned early that contributing to grove maintenance was not merely labor but participation in a shared legacy. In subtle ways, the grove became a mirror of the community itself, orderly, interdependent, and sustained by quiet, repeated acts of care. Ceremonial and ritual uses. Breadfruit occasionally entered ceremonial life, though rarely in a dramatic or ostentatious fashion. Feasts were organized around seasonal harvests, with particular cultivars reserved for elders, visiting chiefs, or other socially significant figures. The selection and presentation of fruit were acts of subtle diplomacy, signaling respect, hierarchy, and social memory. Certain rituals marked the planting of new trees or the introduction of transported saplings from other islands. Leaves were laid around the base, soft words were whispered, and small offerings of water or other natural materials were made. The gestures were quiet, meditative, and meaningful, not intended to impress outsiders, but to acknowledge ancestry, continuity, and the living connection between people and their groves. Breadfruit as a symbol of continuity and stability. Unlike short-lived crops, breadfruit trees could produce reliably for decades. A well-maintained grove represented stability. It assured families that food, and therefore survival, could be sustained across generations. Children growing up near these trees internalized the rhythm of care and continuity. They learned patience and attentiveness, recognizing that life required steady effort rather than dramatic action. The symbolism extended to migration. A sapling transported across the ocean was more than a potential food source. It was a living thread connecting homeland and new settlement. Its survival represented hope, foresight, and the subtle skill of gardeners who could carry life across vast, unpredictable seas. Subtle social signaling. Breadfruit allocation also communicated social norms. Which family received the first harvest? Which portion was reserved for elders or visitors? Which fruit was stored for the lean season? Each decision, executed quietly and deliberately, reinforced norms of fairness, respect, and interdependence. Misallocation could create mild social friction, so gardeners exercised careful judgment, quietly managing both the trees and the expectations of people. Even minor distinctions mattered. Softer, sweeter cultivars might be reserved for children, while denser varieties went to elders. Certain trees might be off-limits entirely, designated as ancestral groves or sacred groves. Through these subtle distinctions, the groves encoded the social and cultural hierarchy of the community. Breadfruit in storytelling and oral culture. Stories of ancestors, migrations, and significant events were often intertwined with breadfruit. An elder might recount how a particular cultivar had survived a devastating storm, linking resilience in trees to resilience in people. Another tale might highlight a gardener who successfully transported saplings across hundreds of miles of ocean, quietly shaping the survival of a new settlement. These stories were not epic battles or heroic conquests. They were soft, flowing narratives emphasizing patience, foresight, and care. They reinforced moral lessons subtly: respect your elders, pay attention to your environment, maintain harmony with neighbors, and honor the continuity of life. The spiritual dimension. Breadfruit was subtly sacred, but not in a dramatic or fear-inducing way. Its sacredness was practical and philosophical. A well-tended tree symbolized the ongoing relationship between humans and the environment. Neglect or careless handling was considered a lapse in mindfulness and respect, not a moral failing punishable by gods. Gardeners, aware of these nuances, approached trees with quiet reverence. Their actions modeled respect for both life and community. The trees themselves became teachers. They rewarded patience, demonstrated the importance of timing, and embodied the consequences of care or neglect. Integration into daily life. Breadfruit appeared in meals, storage pits, and social gatherings, anchoring daily routines in seasonal and ecological cycles. Its presence reminded communities of the careful labor behind sustenance, of the slow passage of seasons, and of the intricate interdependence between people and nature. Even mundane tasks, harvesting, peeling, preparing, were imbued with significance. Every act reflected awareness of history, social norms, and ecological relationships. In essence, Breadfruit connected the practical and the symbolic in quiet, unassuming ways. The gardener as cultural custodian. By this stage, it is clear that the gardener was not only an agricultural expert but also a cultural custodian. He maintained groves, mediated social expectations, trained apprentices, and preserved ancestral knowledge. Through his patient stewardship, the breadfruit grove became a living archive of communal memory, values, and identity. Even when navigating setbacks, storms, pests, or minor social disputes, the gardener reinforced cultural continuity. Recovery was as much about restoring ecological balance as it was about reinforcing social and symbolic norms. He acted quietly but with profound influence, ensuring that every community event, meal, or ritual could unfold in alignment with cultural rhythms. Legacy across generations. Breadfruit trees planted centuries ago still influence communities today. Their arrangement, diversity, and care patterns reflect accumulated wisdom. Each harvest, every apprentice trained, every subtle ritual performed, all contributed to an enduring cultural ecosystem. The gardener's influence, largely invisible to outsiders, is nonetheless tangible. Villagers might not know the names of the earliest gardeners, but they inherit their work, their ethics, and their methods. Groves carry memory, shaping both food security and cultural identity. Let's drift toward philosophical reflections. Breadfruit embodies continuity, patience, and the understated value of attentive care. It teaches that life's sustainability relies on observation, foresight, and steady effort rather than spectacle or dramatic action. Communities thrive not only because of abundant harvests but because people internalize the rhythms of care, respect, and subtle interdependence encoded in the groves. The quiet authority of gardeners, the slow transport of saplings across the ocean, and the careful management of social expectations all converge into a single, enduring lesson: continuity matters and attention matters. Small, consistent actions ripple through generations, securing life and identity in ways that dramatic gestures rarely achieve. In summary, breadfruit was practical, providing staple nutrition and food security; social, reinforcing hierarchy, fairness, and communal cooperation; symbolic, embodying hope, continuity, and ancestral connection; cultural, embedded in storytelling, ritual, and oral history; philosophical, teaching patience, observation, and subtle authority. Even as centuries passed, these layers persisted. Groves remained living classrooms, trees became teachers, and gardeners quietly ensured that both people and plants thrived together. In the next chapter, we'll drift into the stories of individual gardeners and their subtle heroism, tracing how their patient work shaped voyages, settlements, and cultural memory without drama, spectacle, or recognition. By now, the rhythm of life among breadfruit groves has become familiar: patient observation, careful transplantation, apprenticeship, quiet mediation, and enduring cultural influence. But behind these groves were individuals, gardeners whose subtle heroism shaped communities without fanfare. Their deeds were not recorded in chronicles of kings or battles, but in the survival of settlements, the flourishing of groves, and the steady transmission of knowledge across generations. Let's drift into the everyday heroism. A gardener faced countless micro-decisions daily. Which sapling required extra attention? Which fruit was ready for harvest? How should a minor pest be addressed without disturbing the grove? How to mediate a family dispute over allocation without creating resentment? None of these choices were dramatic, but all carried consequences. A misstep might not make history books, but it could affect the survival and harmony of the village. The quiet heroism was in consistently making the right choice, every day, season after season. No applause, no titles, just calm vigilance. Consider the voyaging gardener, responsible for transporting saplings across open ocean. We've discussed how these voyages involved careful preparation, selecting cuttings, wrapping roots, and securing them against sun, salt, and wind. But consider the hours spent in constant, gentle attention during weeks at sea. Canoes pitched and rolled. Storms threatened. Saltwater splashed. Saplings were fragile. The gardener's hands were steady. Every adjustment, every repositioning of a basket, every soft whisper to a tree was an act of understated heroism. Success meant that when the new settlement landed, there was a sustainable food source. Failure meant hardship. And yet, he carried out his responsibility calmly, quietly, without expectation of recognition. Let's drift toward gardeners' role in crises. Even after planting, disasters occurred: storms, droughts, or pest infestations. A gardener's response was never dramatic. There were no heroics in the cinematic sense. Instead, there was steady assessment, incremental adjustment, and patient application of knowledge. If a grove lost a portion of its fruit, he would prioritize recovery. Damaged saplings were stabilized. Soil was redistributed. New cuttings were planted to replace losses. Simultaneously, social expectations were managed. Families received explanations, allocations were adjusted, and mild tensions were diffused. The gardener's heroism lay in orchestrating continuity from disruption, quietly and effectively. Consider also the transfer of knowledge as heroism. Apprenticeships were lengthy and often subtle. An apprentice might spend years simply observing the gardener. Each lesson was embedded in repeated, slow action: pruning, soil assessment, harvesting, or mediation. Mistakes were corrected gently. Observing mistakes and adjustments taught apprentices to internalize wisdom. This slow, careful instruction ensured that a single gardener's expertise could survive his lifetime. The heroism was temporal, spanning decades, generations, and even islands. A single failure to teach properly could jeopardize the survival of future settlements. And yet, the gardener approached teaching with calm patience, never dramatic, always attentive. Let's drift toward individual stories, reconstructed from oral traditions and historical observation. One gardener, known simply in his community as Tue, was responsible for introducing a rare cultivar across several islands. He meticulously transported cuttings over weeks, adjusting baskets in the canoe, shielding roots, and monitoring soil moisture. When a storm arrived mid-voyage, Tue worked quietly to stabilize the saplings, maintaining calm despite water splashing over the canoe and winds threatening to overturn small vessels. When they reached the island, Tue planted each sapling according to microclimates and social norms, allocating trees to families carefully and thoughtfully. Over decades, his initial efforts resulted in a thriving grove that sustained generations. No one recorded his name in grand chronicles. But every fruit, every harvest, every child who grew up nourished by that grove carried the imprint of his labor. Another gardener, Moana, faced persistent droughts that threatened a young settlement. She implemented subtle but effective strategies, rotating saplings for optimal sun exposure, adjusting soil moisture carefully, and prioritizing care for the most vulnerable cultivars. Meanwhile, she mediated minor disputes over water allocation with calm, gentle words. By the end of the season, the community had survived. The groves recovered, food stores remained sufficient, and social harmony was preserved. Her heroism was not loud or ostentatious, but it ensured continuity in the face of hardship. Let's drift toward the unsung innovation of gardeners. While Polynesians are known for navigation and voyaging skill, gardeners innovated quietly, often without recognition. They selected the most resilient cultivars, developed subtle pruning techniques, and refined methods of storage to extend the life of breadfruit. These innovations were slow, iterative, and cumulative. One gardener's careful observation might take years to reveal a subtle advantage. A certain microclimate favored a cultivar's fruiting, or a specific pruning method prevented early spoilage. Apprentices absorbed these lessons, and over generations, groves became more resilient and productive. Even the relationship with apprentices exemplified subtle heroism. Training was demanding yet gentle. A gardener monitored the growth of knowledge and skill in another human being. Each misstep required correction without discouragement. Each success was quietly acknowledged. Over years, the apprentice matured into a competent gardener, capable of sustaining groves, managing social allocations, and maintaining cultural practices. The true measure of heroism was not in immediate results, but in enduring impact. A single well-trained apprentice could maintain a village's groves for decades, perpetuating both ecological and social stability. Let's drift toward the broader impact of these individual efforts. Every successful voyage, every well-maintained grove, and every apprentice trained contributed to community resilience. Food security was ensured. Social harmony was preserved. Cultural practices endured. Even without formal recognition, these gardeners shaped the survival of Polynesian societies. Their heroism was relational, temporal, and ecological. It existed in the calm, steady, persistent execution of responsibilities that were invisible to outsiders but essential to everyone within the community. Finally, consider the philosophy embedded in this quiet heroism. Gardeners demonstrated that patience, observation, and small consistent actions could outweigh dramatic gestures. Survival and continuity depended on care, subtle judgment, and social tact. Life, as encoded in breadfruit groves, was a system of slow, deliberate choices. A system that honored foresight over spectacle, attentiveness over heroics, and continuity over temporary acclaim. Even centuries later, the legacy of these gardeners persists. Groves thrive, communities endure, and cultural memory of patient cultivation continues to shape both daily life and social expectations. Individual gardeners' subtle heroism is inscribed not in monuments but in the enduring vitality of the land and the people who rely on it. In the next chapter, we'll drift into the interplay between breadfruit cultivation, settlement expansion, and Polynesian navigation, observing how gardeners' patient labor enabled migrations across thousands of miles of ocean, again, quietly, without fanfare, but with profound consequences for survival. We have spent time wandering quietly through groves, apprenticeships, and the subtle heroism of individual gardeners. Now, let's drift into how these humble figures shaped the very expansion of Polynesian settlements. Breadfruit was not merely sustenance. It was a strategic resource, a tool for survival, and, in a slow, unassuming way, a catalyst for migration across vast ocean distances. Breadfruit as a settlement enabler. Polynesian voyagers did not set out lightly. Each journey across open ocean required meticulous planning. Food had to be transported, stored, and preserved. Breadfruit trees, with their long shelf life and adaptability, were integral to this planning. A single sapling, carefully packed and tended during the voyage, could sustain future generations on a new island. Here, the gardener's role was pivotal. Not only did he select the most resilient cuttings, but he also ensured that they survived transport. Wrapping roots, securing leaves, and monitoring soil moisture were small, repetitive acts with enormous consequences. The survival of an entire community could hinge on the calm, consistent attention of one gardener, voyaging as slow, careful labor. Contrary to romantic depictions of daring Polynesian explorers, the transport of breadfruit was quiet, methodical work. Saplings were fragile. Canoes rocked on swells. Winds and rain threatened to upset baskets of carefully prepared cuttings. The gardener worked patiently, often for days on end, adjusting baskets, softening roots, and whispering encouragement to the plants, not literally of course, but in practice maintaining constant, gentle attention. It was a repetitive, low-drama type of heroism. Success was measured in survival, not in glory. Upon arrival at new islands, the planting of breadfruit saplings was deliberate and strategic. Microclimates were considered: sheltered valleys for young saplings, well-drained slopes for more mature trees, protection from prevailing winds. The placement of trees was intertwined with social planning: which family would receive the first fruit, how future harvests would be shared, and which cultivars might become communal versus lineage-specific. Here again, subtle social authority mattered. The gardener quietly orchestrated both ecological and human systems simultaneously. He mediated disputes, distributed labor, and ensured that the trees would thrive in alignment with both environment and community needs. Breadfruit and inter-island connectivity. Saplings were not always planted once and left. Gardeners monitored their groves, sometimes returning on subsequent voyages to introduce additional cultivars or reinforce failing trees. These repeated acts created continuity across islands, linking distant settlements through living, growing networks of breadfruit. In a way, Every tree was a node in a slow, quiet network. Each sapling represented foresight, planning, and patient labor, extending the gardener's influence across miles of ocean and decades of time. Subtle ecological intelligence. Gardeners understood soils, microclimates, and seasonal patterns intuitively. They could anticipate which tree would thrive in which valley, which sapling required extra shade, or how to rotate planting to reduce pest or disease pressure. This knowledge was cumulative, learned over decades, and passed through apprenticeships. It's easy to imagine the temptation for shortcuts: transport fewer saplings, plant wherever convenient, skip minor maintenance. But experienced gardeners knew that small lapses could jeopardize survival. Their quiet diligence ensured resilience. Let's drift towards social ramifications. New settlements were delicate systems. A failed crop could trigger scarcity, disputes, or migration failure. The gardener's work was central to social stability. When breadfruit thrived, families ate, feasts proceeded, and rituals were honored. When it faltered, the gardener mediated disputes, redistributed resources, and worked on recovery, always subtly, without fanfare. Through slow, deliberate action, the gardener shaped not only survival but social cohesion. Success was never individual glory but the quiet assurance that communities endured. Consider apprentices on voyages. Young learners often accompanied gardeners during inter-island transport. These apprentices absorbed not only horticultural skill but also lessons in patience, observation, and problem-solving under pressure. Mistakes were corrected gently, and lessons were reinforced over time. Apprenticeship at sea was intense yet low-key. There were no dramatic rescues or heroic speeches, just careful attention, repetition, and subtle guidance. The apprentices internalized wisdom that would later support groves and communities on distant islands. Breadfruit and long-term settlement planning. Gardeners contributed to decisions about where new villages might be established. Fertile valleys, reliable water sources, and appropriate microclimates for saplings were all evaluated. Their knowledge of cultivars, soil, and weather patterns allowed explorers and community leaders to make informed choices. A village might thrive for generations because a gardener had chosen the right planting site decades earlier. Another village might struggle if this expertise was lacking. The subtle hand of the gardener shaped the distribution and sustainability of populations, often quietly behind the scenes. Let's float into the symbolism of voyaging with breadfruit. Transporting saplings represented foresight, continuity, and respect for life. It symbolized a belief in long-term survival and responsibility. Each sapling carried ancestral knowledge, cultural norms, and ecological intelligence. By ensuring its survival, the gardener maintained not only food security but the intangible connections between past, present, and future. In this way, breadfruit groves on new islands were living monuments. They commemorated the patient work of gardeners, the foresight of voyagers, and the enduring continuity of culture across the vast Pacific. Subtle heroism repeated. Every voyage, planting, and grove management was an act of understated heroism. These gardeners did not seek recognition, and most names are lost to history. But their influence persisted in every thriving grove, every stable village, and every apprentice who carried knowledge forward. Even minor adjustments, moving a sapling to avoid salt spray, pruning leaves to prevent mold, or redistributing fruit fairly, had cascading effects on survival. Heroism in this context was patient, consistent, and relational, not dramatic. Let's drift toward the cumulative impact across centuries. Polynesian expansion across thousands of miles of ocean relied on this slow, quiet work. Communities survived, flourished, and maintained cultural identity. Groves endured, apprentices matured into skilled gardeners, and knowledge flowed seamlessly across islands and generations. Without these gardeners, voyages might have failed, settlements might have struggled, and communities could have faltered. Yet their work remained largely invisible to historical records, remembered instead in the continuity of life itself. Finally, consider the philosophical resonance. Breadfruit, gardens, and gardeners illustrate a subtle truth: sustained attention, patience, and quiet labor can shape human survival and cultural continuity more profoundly than spectacle or heroics. The world, in this microcosm, rewards diligence, foresight, and relational intelligence. Gardeners manage trees, mediated social dynamics, and guided communities, quietly, slowly, and without expectation of recognition. Their lives, repeated across generations, ensured the survival of communities and the flourishing of culture. In the next chapter, we'll drift into the role of breadfruit groves in seasonal cycles, storage, and community planning, observing how patient foresight ensured survival year-round, again quietly and methodically, without spectacle or drama. Now that we've traced the role of gardeners in settlement expansion and inter-island voyaging, let's drift into another vital aspect of breadfruit cultivation: seasonal rhythms, storage strategies, and the slow, meticulous planning that ensured year-round survival. This part of the gardener's work was as unglamorous as it was essential. There were no heroic rescues, just careful observation, patience, and subtle orchestration. Seasonal cycles and the gardener's rhythm. Breadfruit did not produce uniformly throughout the year. There were peaks and lulls, subtle variations depending on microclimates, soil conditions, and cultivar type. The gardener observed these fluctuations carefully, noting when leaves matured, when fruit set, and when ripening would occur. These observations were recorded mentally, passed to apprentices through repeated walks through the groves, and integrated into community planning. Villagers learned to anticipate harvest periods, aligning labor, storage, and distribution accordingly. Knowledge of seasonal cycles was cumulative. Gardeners built decades of observations into predictive intuition. Harvest timing. The precise timing of harvest was critical. Early harvest could mean fruit that was not fully mature, with lower nutritional value and shorter storage life. Late harvest risked spoilage, especially in humid conditions or during periods of high pest activity. Gardeners developed subtle heuristics to determine readiness. They examined the color, texture, and firmness of fruit. They observed the position of branches and the density of leaves. Apprentices learned these cues gradually, often by standing quietly beside the gardener, imitating actions, and receiving gentle correction when mistakes occurred. Harvesting as a social act. Harvesting was never purely mechanical. The allocation of fruit required careful social management. Who received the first portions? How were elders or visiting family members prioritized? Which cultivars were reserved for ceremonies or communal meals? The gardener mediated these decisions subtly. Sometimes it involved soft words, sometimes it required demonstrating precedent or quietly reminding families of prior agreements. Disputes were managed through calm authority rather than drama. Even the seemingly mundane act of distributing breadfruit became a lesson in fairness, patience, and social cohesion. Storage strategies. After harvesting, storage became the next focus. Breadfruit could be preserved for weeks if handled carefully. Gardeners developed methods for maximizing longevity. Fruit was stored in cool, shaded pits or under large leaves. Airflow was maintained to prevent mold. Overripe or damaged fruit was used first to prevent loss. Specific cultivars were reserved for future use or ceremonial purposes. These methods were subtle, low-drama interventions with high impact. They reflected keen observation, accumulated experience, and patience. Improper storage risked spoilage, but careful, deliberate management ensured that food security persisted even during lean months. Rotation and prioritization. Gardeners implemented rotational systems. Older, riper fruit was consumed first. Younger fruit or varieties with longer shelf life were saved for later. Saplings and groves were maintained simultaneously, balancing the needs of present consumption with future production. Apprentices absorbed these strategies through observation and repeated practice. The mental mapping of which fruit to harvest, store, or distribute became second nature over time. Knowledge of rotation was as crucial as understanding seasonal cycles or planting patterns. Let's drift toward preparing for scarcity. Despite careful observation and storage, occasional lean periods occurred. Unexpected storms, minor pest outbreaks, or seasonal variation could reduce yields. Gardeners responded by rationing, reallocating fruit, or adjusting labor to prioritize essential tasks. These interventions were quiet, pragmatic, and low-profile. No announcements were made. No dramatic public interventions were required. Villagers learned to trust the gardener's judgment, confident that continuity and stability would be maintained. Community coordination. Maintaining groves, monitoring storage, and distributing fruit required subtle coordination. Families contributed labor at scheduled times. Apprentices assisted with pruning and transport, and elders offered advice on allocation. The gardener, again, functioned as both coordinator and mediator. He ensured tasks were completed without conflict, adjusted strategies when needed, and monitored outcomes over weeks and months. His authority was quiet, relational, and deeply trusted. Subtle observation of environmental cues. Gardens were not isolated from the broader ecosystem. Rainfall, wind patterns, insect activity, and soil conditions influenced both growth and storage. Gardeners learned to read subtle signs: the direction of wind predicting rainfall, early leaf yellowing indicating nutrient deficiency, or minor pest activity signaling a need for intervention. This ecological literacy was cumulative, passed from generation to generation. Apprentices learned to notice patterns, integrate observations, and respond proportionally, all without drama or urgency. Ritualized interaction with seasonal cycles. Even routine activities were occasionally ritualized. First harvests, preparation of storage pits, or the pruning of specific groves were sometimes accompanied by quiet gestures acknowledging ancestors, the community, or the ongoing cycles of nature. These rituals reinforced attentiveness and continuity, embedding cultural values in daily labor. Training apprentices in seasonal awareness. Apprenticeships included careful instruction in timing, storage, and rotation. Learning when to harvest, how to store, and how to distribute required repeated observation and gentle correction. The slow rhythm of apprenticeship mirrored the slow rhythm of the seasons, reinforcing both ecological knowledge and patience. Gardeners emphasized that mistakes were instructive. A misjudged harvest or poorly stored fruit became a quiet lesson in observation, foresight, and attention to detail. Over time, apprentices internalized these patterns, ensuring continuity across generations. Breadfruit and community planning. Beyond food security, breadfruit groves influenced broader community rhythms. Seasonal cycles determined labor allocation, social gatherings, and ceremonial timing. Harvest peaks coincided with feasts, minor rituals, and preparations for voyages. Lean periods required careful rationing, quiet negotiations, and adaptive strategies. The gardener's work thus extended beyond the grove itself, influencing village life in subtle but profound ways. Food, culture, and social order were intertwined through patient observation, measured interventions, and relational authority. Quiet heroism in continuity. Year after year, gardeners maintained the cycles that sustained life. Success was not marked by grand gestures or fame. Instead, it was measured in the survival of groves, the maturity of apprentices, the stability of food stores, and the seamless rhythm of communal life. Even when minor setbacks occurred, storms, pests, or storage failures, the gardener applied calm, deliberate adjustments. His work ensured that communities endured, children grew up nourished, and cultural continuity persisted. Philosophical reflection. Seasonal cycles, storage strategies, and patient oversight illustrate the quiet philosophy of Polynesian gardening. Life was sustained not by dramatic interventions, but by slow, consistent attention. Food security, social harmony, and cultural memory were all intertwined, quietly maintained by gardeners who understood the rhythms of nature and human society. Through this lens, the breadfruit grove becomes more than a food source. It is a living classroom, a social instrument, and a subtle archive of ecological and cultural knowledge. Each tree, each sapling, and each harvested fruit embodies centuries of patient work, observation, and quiet heroism. In the next chapter, we'll drift into the long-term ecological impacts of breadfruit cultivation, exploring how gardens shaped soil, microclimates, and island ecosystems over generations, all orchestrated by gardeners who worked methodically, without fanfare, and with remarkable foresight. Having explored the rhythms of seasonal cycles, storage, and the quiet management of community survival, we now drift into another dimension of Polynesian gardening, the long-term ecological impacts of breadfruit cultivation. Unlike dramatic feats of engineering or conquest, this impact was subtle, slow-moving, and cumulative, yet no less significant. The gardener's quiet work shaped landscapes, soil fertility, and local ecosystems across generations. Breadfruit groves as ecological architects. Breadfruit trees are not merely food producers, they actively shape their environment. Their large leaves create shade, regulating undergrowth and microclimates. Their fallen leaves decompose slowly, enriching soil with organic matter and stabilizing nutrient cycles. Roots prevent erosion and maintain soil structure, especially on sloped terrain or near watercourses. Gardeners understood these effects intuitively. They did not plant trees randomly. Spatial arrangements considered wind, sunlight, rainfall, and soil type. Each tree was placed with foresight, balancing immediate yield with long-term ecosystem stability. Over decades, these arrangements produced groves that enhanced biodiversity, stabilized soil, and supported other plant and animal life. Microclimate creation. The careful spacing of trees created specific microclimates within groves. Taller trees shielded younger saplings from strong winds, while dense canopy cover moderated temperature and humidity. Ground-level plants benefited from shade, maintaining moisture and reducing the risk of drought stress. Gardeners managed these microclimates through subtle interventions: pruning, selective thinning, and occasional transplantation. These adjustments were always gradual, never disruptive, maintaining ecological balance while optimizing fruit production. Soil enrichment and fertility. Breadfruit trees contributed to long-term soil health in multiple ways. Leaf litter decomposed into nutrient-rich humus. Roots fostered microbial communities, stabilizing soil structure and enhancing fertility. Fallen fruit, if not harvested immediately, added organic matter that nourished younger trees. Gardeners observed and enhanced these processes. They might add plant material from other parts of the island to accelerate decomposition, adjust tree spacing to reduce competition for nutrients, or rotate young saplings to nutrient-rich soil patches. Over decades, such careful management produced fertile, resilient landscapes capable of sustaining multiple generations of cultivation. Pest and disease management. By cultivating diverse varieties and spacing trees strategically, gardeners minimized the impact of pests and disease. Monocultures were rare. Instead, mixed groves mitigated risks. Observation of micropatterns, leaf damage, pest activity, or soil imbalance informed subtle interventions that maintained both ecological and social stability. This was a form of ecological foresight. Gardeners anticipated problems before they became severe, applying low-intensity, precise solutions that reinforced long-term sustainability. Integration with surrounding ecosystems. Breadfruit groves were rarely isolated from other ecological systems. They often bordered freshwater sources, forested areas, or open fields, creating transitional zones that enhanced biodiversity. Birds, insects, and small mammals interacted with the trees, spreading seeds, pollinating flowers, and maintaining ecological balance. Gardeners recognized these interactions and sometimes facilitated them. Strategic planting and pruning encouraged beneficial species, while limiting overgrowth or competition. The grove became a managed yet interconnected ecosystem, shaped by centuries of quiet, patient observation. Human influence on island ecology. Beyond immediate cultivation, gardeners indirectly influenced broader island ecology. Groves stabilized soil, reducing erosion and sedimentation in coastal areas. Nutrient cycling improved, supporting secondary crops and wild vegetation. These effects enhanced the resilience of island communities, ensuring food security, water quality, and ecological stability over long periods. The gardener's work was both subtle and cumulative. No single intervention created dramatic impact. Rather, decades of careful management shaped the island environment in profound, enduring ways. Successional planting and biodiversity. Gardeners also employed successional planting, integrating young saplings alongside mature trees. This ensured continuous yield while gradually replacing older trees. It also created layered habitats, supporting understory plants, fungi, and small animals. Over time, these practices maintained high levels of biodiversity, both cultivated and wild. The grove became a microcosm of ecological balance, carefully managed yet responsive to natural rhythms. Subtle landscape modification. Strategic placement of trees influenced water flow, wind direction, and soil retention. Groves could act as barriers against erosion or salt spray, protecting settlements and agricultural plots. Paths between trees facilitated movement while limiting soil compaction and runoff. Even small adjustments, pruning, transplanting, or layering leaves, contributed to long-term landscape stability. These interventions were slow and deliberate, not flashy or dramatic. Yet their cumulative effect ensured that both food and environment thrived together. Apprentices as ecological stewards. Training of apprentices included ecological observation. Young learners were taught to notice subtle signs: soil moisture variations, leaf coloration, canopy density, and pest activity. Over decades, apprentices internalized these lessons, ensuring that ecological wisdom persisted across generations. This slow, continuous education reinforced the gardener's role as both cultural and ecological custodian. Knowledge was embodied, transmitted quietly through observation, repetition, and gentle guidance rather than formal instruction. Long-term sustainability. Perhaps the most striking ecological impact was the long-term sustainability of groves. Even after centuries, properly managed breadfruit groves remained productive, resilient, and integrated with surrounding ecosystems. Gardeners ensured that soil fertility, tree health, and social practices aligned to produce ongoing yield. Minor setbacks, storms, pests, or drought were absorbed within this system, mitigated through patient observation and subtle intervention. The result was a resilient socio-ecological system maintained quietly, without spectacle or dramatic recognition. Cultural and ecological synergy. Breadfruit cultivation exemplifies the synergy between culture and ecology. The gardener's patient management of trees reinforced social stability, food security, and ecological balance simultaneously. Apprenticeship, seasonal observation, and subtle interventions ensured that human and environmental systems co-evolved harmoniously. The grove became a living archive, a repository of ecological knowledge, cultural practices, and cumulative wisdom. Each tree, sapling, and harvested fruit carried echoes of decisions made decades or centuries earlier. The quiet labor of gardeners was inscribed into the landscape itself. Philosophical reflection. The ecological impact of breadfruit cultivation demonstrates a broader truth. Subtle, persistent, and thoughtful action can produce enduring effects greater than any singular dramatic effort. The gardener's influence extended beyond immediate yield to long-term landscape management, intergenerational knowledge transfer, and the resilience of entire communities. Even without recognition or dramatic narrative, the gardener shaped life itself: soils, microclimates, biodiversity, human settlement, and social order. This is heroism in its slowest, quietest, and most effective form. Looking ahead, in the next chapter, we will drift into the interconnectedness of breadfruit groves with social rituals, ceremonies, and the broader cosmology of Polynesian societies, observing how these ecological foundations were entwined with cultural and spiritual life, again through the quiet, patient labor of gardeners and their apprentices. Having traced ecological and social dimensions of breadfruit cultivation, we now drift into a quieter, more reflective realm: the interplay of groves with ritual, ceremony, and cosmology in Polynesian societies. Breadfruit, beyond its nutritional and ecological role, held symbolic significance that shaped cultural understanding and community life. Breadfruit in ritual and ceremony. Breadfruit rarely took center stage in dramatic or large-scale rituals. Instead, its role was subtle, understated, and deeply integrated into social rhythms. The timing of harvests often coincided with seasonal feasts, where elders and chiefs received carefully selected fruit. Presentation mattered. Certain cultivars were reserved for special occasions, acknowledging social hierarchy, respect, and communal values. Planting new trees or introducing saplings from distant islands sometimes involved quiet ceremonial gestures. Leaves might be arranged around the base, small offerings of water or plant matter made, and soft words whispered acknowledging ancestry, continuity, and the interconnectedness of life. These gestures reinforced mindfulness, attention, and respect, embedding cultural values within everyday labor. Symbolism of continuity. Breadfruit embodied continuity of food, of lineage, and of cultural memory. Groves symbolized stability, patience, and foresight. A sapling transplanted across the ocean represented hope for future generations, while mature trees anchored community memory. Children grew up observing these rhythms, internalizing lessons in patience, responsibility, and social cohesion. Even mundane tasks, pruning, harvesting, storing, carried implicit symbolic